Today, let us once again address one of the greatest failures of modernity, and in fact, I would say, in philosophical terms, in psychological terms, the greatest failure of modernity, which is to deny, not just to not understand, but to actively deny, to suppress notions of time and change and transformation, to hold the view that however things are how they've always been, and however somebody is how they have always been, unless they are playing a trick on us, and that things are static fundamentally, that things do not change fundamentally. It's a denial of history fundamentally. Uh, Having lived in a different historical period, in fact two or three, I know that things do in fact change. I am fully aware of how much change I have had to undergo to even have a modicum of adaptation to contemporary reality, and it hasn't been an easy road. But to the modern person, things don't change. Things have always been like this, how things are at the moment. And that position is extraordinary. That is really, to interrupt myself, I can see how it comes about. One may well wish to believe that reality is simple, because that's efficient. To have that belief, whether right or wrong, is efficient. And modernity embraces efficiency. So I can see how it comes about. One wishes to have the shortest connection possible to things without much explanation, without much rigmarole. And consequently, one believes that if somebody's telling you things might have been, or in fact were, different in the past, it's not efficient to believe them, whether it's right or wrong. Just it takes too much time to believe them or to try to understand them. And therefore, we don't take it into consideration. Modernity's pragmatism, if you will. But it's extraordinary. They can talk a little bit about history, but it's all very flattened. There's no sense of psychological difference within history. It's more like, well, these people were moderns just like us, only they hadn't been told right from wrong yet. But in every other respect, they were just like us. They just didn't know what was right or wrong. How extraordinary. Imagine if that were true. But this is the unexamined proposition of people who embrace modernity, who were brought up within it, who desire, in fact, to probably need a very simple explanation for everything. I want to talk also about the way the failure, and as I say, not just a failure, but the active refusal to engage with time and change affects therapy, affects the possibility of effective therapy. Because if one is, let's start at the very basics, perhaps, if one is as a therapist or as a client, a potential client, looking for the essence of one's nature in order to find it and improve it, you won't find that essence that exists apart from movement and time and change. You can only catch it. You can only catch an aspect of it within a process of dynamic conversation, of a process of movement and time and change. And you don't really know, supposing that there is some ignition of some essential, which I use advisedly. That term is not really appropriate, but some deeper quality. There's an ignition of a deeper quality that suddenly catches light within a conversation or a dialogue. Then one can ascertain something deeper, but one can never know, in effect, how much of a core part of the personality that really is. It might be an intense part, but it may not still be a core part. It's something that is temporal, and then one has to ascertain its meaning, but one can only do so through recurrent circumstances, through repeating a similar experiment, or through diversifying the experiment and finding what other reactions are in there. And maybe there are some that are more important and more intense, but it always has to be through a dynamic process. One cannot, and here's my point, one cannot do what I have discovered to be a very common thing for people in modernity to do. One cannot suddenly have a gotcha moment. One cannot suddenly attribute a reaction to the essence or the core of a person. And one certainly cannot go beyond that acknowledgement of their reaction to say, well, you were lying to us the whole time. You're the opposite to what you seemed to be. Because there are no essences and there are no opposites. And if you're finding that something seems to be a certain way to you, you need to ask yourself, as a perceiver of how things seem to be, why they seemed to be that way to you when they were in fact not that way in the first instance. Somebody seems this way and then they seem that way. Well, why are they seeming so to you? How is it that you allow your mind to be really controlled or influenced by this so-called seeming? And why do you suddenly think that there's a deeper level to the seeming that is the unchangeable truth about that whole seeming? Are you going to stop being a perceiver, for instance, now that you've discovered the supposed, the alleged, unchangeable truth? You're going to just be a god sitting on a cloud that never has relative truths or relative perceptions? You're just going to perceive in the absolute from now on? Because we don't do that. We cannot do that. We are human. And the one that sits on the cloud, that sits above and perceives things in the absolute is God. Not just a God, but the God. The omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent God. Which I think, to be frank, is what many therapists and many modern people do. Not just at times, but in general, imagine themselves to be. I hope that we're moving out of that level of profound self-aggrandizement and superstition about perception and the possibility of absolute perception. But the old habit dies hard. It's a religious conception fundamentally that there's an essence underlying what seems true. And then also there's, like I've hinted, there's also a sense that if somebody perceives a reality in a different way from how they first perceived it, then it's the object that they've perceived that is deceiving them rather than their own perception that was deceiving them. So there's a failure of a self-critical analysis, a recursive analysis. It's just deemed to be that thing out there that deceived you. It's another mode of magical thinking that first I saw that object and it's a kind of primitive thinking. It's modern, but it's primitive. Like I saw that tree in the morning and it looked green to me. And then I saw the tree as the sun was setting and it kind of looked like it was on fire. It looked like orangey or yellow. The tree deceived me. The tree was playing a trick. It was trying to pretend to be something it hadn't been in the first instance. Damn that tree! You know, this is an example that is, of course, primitive, but it's also true of modern people when they say that something deceived them. You can actually, somebody can actively deceive you. Well, that's a different thing. But when somebody's not intending to, and it's a passive thing that you had a misconception of them in the first instance, then you revised it. That's your perception that was at fault. It's not the person who did something weird or magical or tricky to you. So I think the big problem I've had in life are these gotcha moments where people suddenly say, you're not what you seem to be. You are the opposite to what you seemed to be. And that's not true. I'm part of a dynamic, I'm part of a system of pressurized movements. I have been very much a part of that system of political and social pressure that I react and respond to. And I don't need to go over it again to say that I came from a very, very right-wing, militant, right-wing Christian country. Then it became very, very left-wing, communist, pro-Russia, revolutionary. And then I went into modernity, which was neither but proclaimed to be above everything, to have omniscience and omnipresence and omnipotence in regard to an understanding of all. So I have been very much, we could say embroiled, but very much directed by these particular forces that I've had to somehow really not just come to terms with, but somehow avoid being totally destroyed by. And, some things may not be as they seem to be as a consequence. I am the subject of many very closely consecutive opposite historical forces. I'm real. I am. That's because of that, and because I have reacted realistically to those, I am real. But nonetheless, what I'm reacting to is not congruous with itself necessarily, which is to say, once again, that these consecutive forces have been in many ways revolutionary and contradictory with each other. And actually radically so, not just in many ways. When I was growing up, my father was under mental stress, having migrated, lost everything, including identity and roots and so on. If I expressed anything negative, he used to say, "What?" He would say to me in the morning, "How are you?" I'm saying, "No, it's not good, it's terrible." And he would say, "What?" And I'd say, "Don't worry about it, I'm fine." And I said it in such a way that he knew I wasn't fine. And then another time he would check up on me and was in the afternoon one day. "So, how are things going?" I'd say, "Well, absolutely fine, absolutely fine." And I would say it once again in a way that I represented that it was the opposite, it wasn't fine. Because I learned, okay, you can't show that things are not fine. When I was growing up in my 20s, my father became quite abusive verbally and sometimes physically. He was very physically abusive to me as a child, but it was sporadic, so I forgot about it. It was mostly happy, my childhood. But when I was in my 20s, I couldn't go anywhere like I used to be able to. Couldn't escape the household. There wasn't an African wilderness for me, and so I was stuck there. And my father used to become very enraged, and I eventually I saw an ad in the paper that said women's self-defense will stop people from attacking you, and it worked like magic on my father. I wasn't good at it, I didn't know much, but the minute I started doing that, his attacks dropped. They dropped to nothing. Then later in life, I stopped doing martial arts, and behold, his physical and verbal attacks on me started up again. And then later I took up martial arts again, and his respect increased. And he withheld his attacks on me. It was a long and complex period of time. But I learned I had to be externally tough and not let anything drop. Even if I felt tired or things actually were horrible or really bad for me, I mustn't show it, otherwise that invites the attack. I learned that you've got to be tough. So if I were to then go to somebody I thought I could have trusted, or a therapist, and I said, well, actually, I know it seems all great, but actually things are not great, and I'm letting you know, that isn't a time for a gotcha moment, like, now she reveals to us her true nature. Oh, it was all a fake and a fraud. She wasn't really so tough. Yes, that's not a time for a gotcha moment, because I am still very, very tough. I've had to have that conditioning. That wasn't not real. That is absolutely real. That conditioning of toughness is absolutely real. But I'm also showing that I was pummeled terribly during a long time, that my emotions could not develop properly during a long time, and that there are some consequences to this toughening up process, and I'm showing it because I want to work with it. It's not a time for a gotcha moment. It's not a time to say, that was wrong all this time. People who think they can find a static and unchangeable essence underneath the dynamic processes and changes wrought on us by history. It's the modern superstition, it's the modern fundamental delusion, and it's the delusion that will undo you. Because it's so simplistic, and it's facile, easy, facile in the sense of embracing something just because it's not difficult. It's facile, and it's well, obviously it's a shortcut to understanding, but it will ultimately undo you. Recently, I've been seeing George Bush and Tony Blair undone by this particular kind of facile kind of reasoning, as in, it suits us. It's the most simple explanation, so we'll embrace that one. And I like it that they are coming under severe criticism now. That is absolutely due to them. That is, that's absolutely necessary to get us out of this lazy thinking and this crazy, lazy, bad, desperate stupidity. I don't know. I'm going to stop. Okay.